Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we take the source material you need to know and really just extract the most surprising, complex, and vital insights.
Today, we are taking a long, unvarnished look at a figure whose life, it really encompasses the foundational conflicts and, frankly, the painful contradictions of American history, Robert E. Lee.
Absolutely.
Mm.
We're talking about a man who, in the space of just a few months, goes from being a highly decorated U.S. Army engineering colonel to the single most important military leader of the Confederacy.
You just can't understand the Civil War or really the century of historical argument that followed without diving deep into Lee. The image of the man, it's often called the Marble Man for its polished, kind of flawless presentation.
Right.
And that image has been so carefully curated over generations. So our mission today, based on this really extensive biographical excerpt we have, is to chip away at that polished veneer and, confront the complexity underneath.
Yes. Our source material is exhaustive. It covers everything from his mathematical rigor at West Point to his strategic blunders at Gettysburg and, of course, his very fraught relationship with the institution of slavery.
Our goal is to give you, the listener, the complete contextual knowledge you need to understand not just what he did, but why his legacy is still the subject of such intense historical and public debate today.
It's like you said, we have to explore these dual identities of Lee. On one hand, the exceptional military engineer who embodied U.S. Army precision.
And on the other, the flawed Confederate general who sacrificed his nation for his native state.
So let's start at the beginning, because that discipline and precision that really defined his wartime command, they were forged in a youth that was characterized by, well, financial instability and this relentless pursuit of order.
Precisely. Robert E. Lee was born January 19, 1807 at Stratford Hall, Virginia. And he's born into the, I guess you could say, the fading gentry of the state.
Yeah.
He had this proud but deeply troubled legacy.
His father was Henry Light Horse Harry Lee III, right? A celebrated Revolutionary War officer.
Celebrated, yes, but also disastrously incompetent with money.
And that's really the key.
Yeah.
The impact of the father's failures on the son is just. It's palpable. Light Horse Harry goes bankrupt. He ends up in debtor's prison, and then eventually he just abandons the family entirely, departs for the West Indies in 1812.
So young Robert spends his formative years in Alexandria dealing with the fallout. It's a constant struggle for solvency, and you see this deep psychological need for order that abandonment often inspires.
That need for order seems absolutely central to his education. He attended the Alexandria Academy, and his studies really emphasized mathematics.
Which was foundational for engineering. The family, still relying on those older Virginia networks, managed to secure him a highly coveted appointment at West Point. That was thanks to an appeal from a relative, William Henry Fitzhugh.
So he gets the appointment, but his performance is purely his own. He enters West Point in 1825, and by the time he graduates second in his class in 1829, he had achieved something. Well, something truly remarkable that foretold his entire career.
That's right, discipline. Lee achieved this distinction, and it was shared by only 5 of his 45 classmates,
Just 5.
incurring 0 demerits during his 4 years of study.
0. That's almost unbelievable.
It wasn't just about following rules. You have to see it as this absolute precision, punctuality, and military rigor that was just ingrained into his personality.
It makes you wonder how that level of, systematic perfection translated into the practical world of military engineering, which was his whole early career focus.
It translated perfectly. His initial assignments were these major national construction projects that required meticulous planning and execution. He worked on draining and building Fort Pulaski in Georgia, which sits on marshland.
A huge engineering challenge.
A massive challenge. And later on, Fort Monroe on the Virginia Peninsula. This was hands-on, high-stakes infrastructure development for the country.
And he was good enough that he earned a promotion to captain for his work on the upper Mississippi and Missouri rivers, specifically for mapping and addressing navigation challenges like the Des Moines Rapids.
Yes, and this was a substantial career, but the source makes a really crucial point about the difference between his wartime rank and his permanent rank.
Let's talk about that.
Well, this is a crucial historical nugget for understanding the mid-19th century Army. He was promoted to captain in the Corps of Engineers in 1838. But even after distinguishing himself in the Mexican-American War, he held that permanent rank all the way until 1855.
Why? Why so long?
Because the U.S. Army was tiny, promotions were incredibly slow, and they were often based on seniority, not necessarily battlefield merit. This stagnation. It was a key frustration for so many gifted officers who would later join the Confederacy.
So while he was building this national defense system, he was also establishing his family. In 1831, he married Mary Anna Randolph Custis at her family home, Arlington House.
And the historical weight of that marriage is just incredible.
It really is.
Mary was the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington, a direct link to the founding era of the Republic.
And the marriage itself was, according to accounts, a study in contrasts.
Yeah.
You have Lee, the model of discipline, tidiness, and punctual routine.
And then you have Mary, who was noted for her difficulty with organization and structure. The sources note she really struggled adapting from being this wealthy daughter of a slaveholder to managing a household with fewer enslaved people, where, she was expected to take a more active role in domestic affairs.
They went on to have 7 children, 3 boys and 4 girls, though one daughter, Anne, sadly died right in the middle of the Civil War.
And that brings us to the next great crucible for Lee, the Mexican-American War, from 1846 to 1848. It really provided the crucial learning experience for the entire generation of officers who would later lead both the Union and Confederate armies.
He served as General Winfield Scott's chief aide, and his distinction came not just from managing logistics, but from dangerous personal reconnaissance.
Right. The source says Lee was known for finding routes that the Mexicans considered literally impassable. What kind of reconnaissance are we talking about?
We're talking about him often on horseback, alone, or with a minimal escort, scouting terrain, especially at places like Cerro Gordo and Chapultepec, trying to find these unexpected attack vectors.
So he's putting himself in incredible personal danger.
Absolutely. Scott relied heavily on his ability to read the landscape. For this heroism, he received 3 brevet promotions: Major, Lieutenant Colonel, and Colonel.
And we should clarify for the listener, a brevet promotion meant he could be addressed by that rank on the battlefield, reflecting his merit. But his actual pay, seniority, and his permanent status in the engineering corps remained captain until 1855.
Which must have been so frustrating. But the war was invaluable. It was here, serving under Scott, that Lee and Ulysses S. Grant met and worked together.
Unknowingly preparing for their later monumental clash, they were learning the same lessons from the same war.
After the war, Lee went back into that cycle of engineering posts and academic duty. He was appointed superintendent of West Point from 1852 to 1855.
A post he reportedly called a snake pit.
A snake pit? He was not a fan of the bureaucracy, I take it?
He was a field commander at heart, but, he used his time there effectively. He improved the curriculum, the infrastructure, and it's a point of pride that his own son, Custis Lee, graduated first in his class during his father's tenure.
But the moment he got the chance for a real field command, he took it.
That moment came in 1855. He received a permanent promotion to lieutenant colonel and accepted the second-in-command role of the 2nd Cavalry in Texas.
So he resigned from the engineering corps entirely to take a coveted combat command.
Exactly, protecting settlers from Apache and Comanche attacks under the command of Albert Sidney Johnston. He finally had the combat command he craved, putting him directly in this volatile, rapidly expanding Western theater.
Right before the issue of slavery and secession tore the nation apart and dragged him back to Virginia.
And that brings us to the phase of his life that is, the most difficult to reconcile with that marble man image.
This is where we step into what the outline calls the moral labyrinth. The period between 1857 and 1862, where Lee, the disciplined U.S. officer, became Lee, the pragmatic and often harsh slaveholder.
This section is absolutely critical. In 1857, Lee's father-in-law, G.W. Parke Custis, died, leaving Lee the executor of this complex, heavily debt-ridden estate that included Arlington House, massive land holdings, and nearly 200 enslaved people.
And the centerpiece of this whole mess was the will. The will explicitly required Lee to free the enslaved people within 5 years of Custis's death. This wasn't an option, it was a mandate.
It was a mandate, but it was complicated by massive debt and years of poor plantation management. The sources are very clear on this. Lee was the executor of a chaotic financial situation, and he prioritized solvency.
He used a provision in the will to legally retain the enslaved people in bondage for the full 5 years,
leveraging their labor to produce income and retire the estate's massive debts.
That detail. It speaks volumes about his character as an administrator. The highly disciplined, precise engineer was maximizing the economic output of human beings, delaying their legally mandated freedom for financial gain.
And he finally filed the deed of manumission on December 29, 1862. It's impossible to ignore the context. He waited until the absolute last legal day he was permitted to under the terms of the will.
The maximum permissible time. A clear choice driven by economics, not not morality or any haste toward abolition.
In this administration, this delay was met with immediate, and you can imagine, understandable resistance from the enslaved people who had been promised their freedom sooner. The expectation was high.
And that delay, coupled with Lee's strict discipline, well, it created conflict.
Yes. Lee applied the same rigorous military-style discipline he used in the army to the plantation. He often complained in letters about the difficulty of finding an overseer who would be both considerate and kind to the Negroes, but also firm and make them do their duty.
And when he couldn't find one, he took over himself.
For 2 years, imposing his own standards. Which leads us directly to the single most controversial incident of his life as a slaveholder, the Norris case of 1859.
Okay, let's unpack this. The circumstances were dire. 3 enslaved people, Wesley Norris, his sister Mary, and a cousin fled the plantation. They were seeking freedom in the North.
But they were captured near the Pennsylvania border and brought back to Arlington.
After the war, Wesley Norris gave this shocking, detailed account. It was published in an abolitionist newspaper in 1866. What exactly did Norris claim happened?
Norris claimed that Lee had them tied to posts and ordered them to be whipped 50 lashes for the men, 20 for Mary. And crucially, Norris alleged that Lee stood by and encouraged the county constable administering the lashing, saying to lay it on well.
And then ordered brine applied to the raw wounds afterward.
A common, incredibly painful anti-infection method used in slave discipline.
This account stands in such stark contrast to the gentlemanly image that was later promoted. And the historical community's handling of this account really demonstrates a significant shift in historiography.
Oh, absolutely. Early 20th century biographers, especially those writing during the peak of the Lost Cause era, like Douglas S. Freeman in 1934, they just dismissed Norris's account.
Out of hand.
Completely. They labeled it the extravagance of irresponsible anti-slavery agitators, arguing it was just incompatible with Southern gentlemanly conduct. The myth required a denial of the cruelty.
But the more rigorous modern analysis tells a very different story. What's the contemporary historical consensus on the Norris case?
Well, while most modern historians agree that the claim that Lee personally administered the whip to a woman is extremely unlikely, they concur on the essential facts of the incident.
Sure.
That Lee sought the recapture, he ordered severe punishment, which included flogging, and he enforced his disciplinary system. And that system included hiring the runaways out to plantations further south, effectively separating them from their families and any prospect of imminent freedom. Corporal punishment was an intrinsic, brutal part of his administration.
The sources also point to another hard-nosed practice. Lee separated enslaved families. We see it with the Norris family, but the source notes that by 1860, only one enslaved family remained intact on the estate.
And that was a practice that even prominent Virginia families like the Washingtons and Custises had often avoided, due to the social stigma and the difficulty of selling whole families. It highlights a professional, almost mechanical ruthlessness in his management of the estate.
Which is so hard to square with the other side of this complexity, which is his private reflection on the institution itself. We have the famous 1856 letter to his wife, where he called slavery a moral and political evil in any country.
Right, and that quote is so often cited by his defenders to show his moral opposition to slavery. But when you read the full context,
The very next sentence.
it immediately qualifies that opposition in a way that reveals his profound belief in racial hierarchy. That qualification is the heart of the contradiction. Immediately after condemning it as an evil, he argues it was a greater evil to the white man than to the black race.
He justified the institution by claiming that blacks were immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically.
And the final, most jarring part of that passage, where he argues that the painful discipline of slavery was necessary for their instruction as a race and part of God's purpose.
That belief structure is just crucial to understanding the Confederacy. He wasn't arguing for immediate abolition, which he feared would cause a devastating civil and servile war.
No. He subscribed fully to the paternalistic Southern view that the black race required subjugation and gradual instruction before they could be prepared for freedom, an instruction he was personally enforcing through flogging and family separation on his own plantation.
So his moral condemnation was filtered entirely through this racial hierarchy that demanded white political and social control. Given that we've traced the highly disciplined U.S. Army engineer and the conflicted, ruthless slaveholder, the next question becomes, when the nation split, which identity would triumph?
And that leads us to the unavoidable choice of 1861. But it was preceded by one final act of loyalty to the Union. The suppression of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859.
Right. The federal government, under President James Buchanan, needed a highly competent officer to handle this crisis, this abolitionist attempt to incite a massive slave rebellion. And they chose Colonel Lee, who was then on leave from his Texas post.
And Lee executed the mission with his characteristic speed and precision. He was given command of the U.S. forces, Marines, and militia. When John Brown refused to surrender, Lee ordered the attack, and within 3 minutes of fighting, Brown and his followers were captured.
Lee's report back to Washington summarized Brown simply as a fanatic or madman. It was a perfect display of martial professionalism, reinforcing his reputation as a loyal, effective U.S. officer.
And then, 2 years later, that loyalty was tested to its breaking point. By early 1861, the Deep South had seceded and Virginia was wavering. And Lee himself, privately, opposed the idea of disunion.
He called secession nothing but revolution, and argued it was an unconstitutional act that represented an accumulation of all the evils we complain of. He even stated he would sacrifice the 4 millions of slaves in the South for the preservation of the Union.
That is a profound declaration. But you have to understand the Virginia Code of Honor. For Lee, personal honor and his duty to his native state, to the soil where his family history was rooted, ultimately outweighed his opposition to secession.
So the moment of decision arrives in April 1861. Lee is offered a senior command major general in the expanding Union Army by presidential advisor Francis P. Blair.
Specifically to command the defense of the national capital. This was a direct path to continued military glory and command of a powerful, modern army.
And his famous reply sealed his feet and the feet of the Confederacy. Mr. Blair, I look upon secession as anarchy, but how can I draw my sword upon Virginia, my native state?
He resigned his U.S. Army commission as a colonel of the 1st Cavalry on April 20th, 1861, just 2 days after Virginia voted to secede.
He was immediately elected Major General and Commander of Virginia forces upon his arrival in Richmond.
And the tragic irony is that his mentor, General Winfield Scott, who was commanding the Union Army, warned him. He told him he had made the greatest mistake of your life. Scott saw the coming scale of the war and understood what Lee was throwing away.
I think one of the most poignant details from the sources about this period is his choice of insignia. He wore the 3 stars of a Confederate colonel, the equivalent of his last U.S. Army rank throughout the war.
Perhaps as a silent homage to the Army, he felt compelled to leave. And the choice was deeply personal. You see the family fractures as well. While Lee and most of his family chose the South, his sister Anne remained fiercely pro-Union. They never spoke again.
So Lee made his choice. He aligned himself with the revolution he hated and immediately stepped into command of this nascent, untested military force. But his initial performance was, well, it was anything but triumphant.
Absolutely. The Lee, who was lauded for his precision in Mexico and at Harper's Ferry, was initially criticized as being too tentative. His first field assignment in Western Virginia was a decisive defeat at the Battle of Cheat Mountain in September 1861.
This loss led to immediate and painful public and press criticism. They nicknamed him Granny Lee, implying he was too cautious, too old-fashioned.
Or just too hesitant to commit to battle. Public confidence plummeted. But Confederate President Jefferson Davis recognized his strategic mind and moved him into advisory roles.
First in Richmond and then organizing coastal defenses in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, a role that played directly to his strengths as an engineer.
And his work there was highly effective. The source mentions he developed a defense in depth that successfully protected Savannah from a federal advance for months.
Can you elaborate on what defense in depth meant back then?
Well, it meant moving beyond just a simple linear coastal fort defense. Instead of only relying on heavy guns right on the coastline, Lee used the physical geography. He placed defenses at various staggered points, inland roads, bridges, swamps, forcing the Federals to fight multiple engagements to gain any ground.
So he's maximizing the terrain.
Exactly. Maximizing the defensive capabilities of the terrain and minimizing the need for large troop concentrations. It was a technique far ahead of its time.
And back in Richmond, even his engineering brilliance was ridiculed. He earned another nickname, the King of Spades, for his insistence on digging extensive trench lines around the Confederate capital.
That is the ultimate irony, isn't it? People scoffed at the idea of dug-in fortifications. They believed in decisive, glamorous maneuver warfare. But Lee was preparing for a war of attrition.
The war he knew was coming.
And those same trenches later became the pivotal defense lines at Petersburg that allowed the Confederacy to survive for nearly a year longer than it might have otherwise.
Everything changed in June 1862. General Joseph E. Johnston was wounded during the Peninsula Campaign, and Lee was finally put in charge of the main force.
Which he immediately renamed the Army of Northern Virginia. This command change was a metamorphosis for Lee. He immediately shocked the Union commander, George McClellan, by launching a rapid series of bold, aggressive attacks known as the 7 Days Battles.
The attacks were certainly bold, but they were also incredibly costly for the Confederacy, weren't they? He was aggressive to the point of seeming reckless.
He was. Lee accepted much higher casualties than his predecessors because his objective was always strategic.
Yeah.
He had to drive the Federals away from Richmond. And despite the losses, he succeeded. He drove the much larger Union Army away from the capital, ending the Peninsula Campaign and dramatically boosting Confederate morale.
This success cemented his reputation, earning him that affectionate nickname, Marse Robert, among his troops. They now saw him as their indispensable leader.
And that strategic success had massive consequences for the Union political landscape. The setback forced President Lincoln to take drastic measures, realizing that emancipation had to become a military act to cripple the Confederacy.
But to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, he needed a victory.
And Lee, meanwhile, was relentless. He next defeated General John Pope at the Second Battle of Bull Run in August 1862, pushing the battle lines 82 miles north. He had successfully shifted the war dramatically toward Union soil,
Which led directly to his first major strategic push into Union territory, the invasion of Maryland in September 1862.
Lee hoped to gather supplies, relieve Virginia, and, most importantly, win a decisive victory on Union soil that might compel Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy.
But this entire operation was compromised by one catastrophic failure of operational security: the Lost Dispatch.
Yes, Special Order 191. Lee's detailed plans were somehow lost, wrapped around 3 cigars, and recovered by Union forces. So McClellan, despite his characteristic slowness, now knew the entire disposition of the Confederate Army,
Including the fact that it was dangerously divided.
which led to the Battle of Antietam, the single bloodiest day of the war. Lee's army, despite being outnumbered and strategically compromised, somehow fought the Union to a tactical standstill.
Tactically inconclusive, yes, but strategically profound for the Union. Lee was forced to retreat back to Virginia. And crucially, this compelled withdrawal was sufficient for Lincoln to declare it a Union victory.
Giving him the political cover he needed to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22, 1862.
And that act immediately placed the Confederacy on the diplomatic and moral defensive globally. It fundamentally changed the war's objective from merely preserving the Union to actively destroying slavery.
Yet, Lee remained a terrifyingly effective tactical commander. He followed Antietam with a major one-sided victory at Fredericksburg in December 1862 against Ambrose Burnside.
Mostly due to strong defensive organization and Burnside's insistence on these futile frontal assaults. The casualty figures are stunning: 12,600 Union casualties to 5,000 Confederates.
After witnessing the slaughter from a hill, Lee reportedly uttered that sobering, often-quoted phrase, "It is well that war is so terrible, else we should grow too fond of it."
And this leads right into his tactical masterwork, Chancellorsville, in May 1863.
He's facing a significantly larger Union force under Joseph Hooker, and Lee defies all conventional wisdom by dangerously dividing his already smaller army.
He sends Stonewall Jackson on that daring flanking maneuver that caught the exposed Union flank completely by surprise, an astonishing display of battlefield audacity.
An impressive tactical victory, arguably his best, but it came with an immense, unrecoverable cost. Jackson was accidentally shot by his own men and died a week later.
Lee had won the battle, but lost his most aggressive and brilliant lieutenant.
And the loss of Jackson, combined with the strategic failure to gain decisive ground, left Lee restless. He still believed the South needed that one decisive victory on Union soil to end the war.
That restlessness and that desire for a knockout blow really set the stage for what comes next: Gettysburg and the War of Attrition.
Following Chancellorsville, Lee launched his second and ultimately catastrophic invasion of the North. The source suggests this was a major strategic blunder right from the initial decision.
Why so?
Well, Lee had a bias toward offensive action. He believed he had to relieve Virginia and gather supplies from the rich Pennsylvania farmland. But his decision to push north came despite military advisors urging President Davis to focus resources on saving Vicksburg.
Which was crumbling under Grant's pressure in the West. Why was Vicksburg so important?
Vicksburg was the key to the Mississippi River. Losing it meant splitting the Confederacy in two and allowing the Union complete control of the western interior, isolating Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas.
But Lee's argument prevailed.
It did, authorizing the Northern Offensive, a decision later viewed by historians as sacrificing the entire Western theater for a high-risk gamble in the East.
The Battle of Gettysburg itself, in early July 1863, was an accidental encounter that quickly escalated, and the Confederate forces were immediately hampered by key military failures.
First and foremost, the failure of J.E.B. Stuart's cavalry to provide effective reconnaissance. Lee was fighting virtually blind in enemy territory, unaware of the exact Union strength or deployment.
And the terrain decisions were disastrous. On day one, Lee's forces successfully pushed the Union back, but the pursuit stopped short, allowing the Federals to consolidate on key high ground that General Ewell failed to seize.
That failure to seize Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill on day one was crucial. Those hills gave the Union the centralized, elevated defensive position, the famous fishhook line, allowing them interior lines to shift troops and supplies rapidly.
So the Confederates were forced to fight uphill for the next 2 days against a concentrated enemy.
An impossible task. Throughout day two, Lee pressed attacks but faced stiff resistance and heavy losses. Then came day three and the strategic failure that defines the battle, Pickett's charge.
Lee rejected the advice of his most trusted corps commander, James Longstreet.
Longstreet urged a flanking maneuver moving the army around the Union left to force Meade to attack them on ground of Confederate choosing. He famously argued that no 15,000 men could successfully take the Union center.
But Lee overruled him. He ordered a massive, futile frontal assault across open ground against the strongest point of the Union line.
The ground was a mile-long, open field completely exposed to Union artillery fire from Cemetery Ridge. The Confederate artillery bombardment failed to seriously damage the Union defenses, and the Federal infantry and cannon just shredded the advancing Confederate lines.
A bloodbath. It resulted in thousands of unrecoverable losses for the Army of Northern Virginia.
And Lee met the remains of the division and made that painful public admission. All this has been my fault.
He was devastated. The Confederate Army never fully recovered from the 28,000 casualties suffered over those 3 days. He even offered his resignation to President Davis on August 8, 1863.
Which Davis, of course, refused. The historical summation is brutal, encapsulated by historian Shelby Foote's quote, "Gettysburg was the price the South paid for having Robert E. Lee as commander."
It seems his aggressive style, which had been his greatest strength, became his greatest strategic flaw when faced with a war of attrition.
And from 1864 onward, it was purely a war of attrition, marked by the relentless duel with Grant. Ulysses S. Grant took command of all Union armies and changed the entire strategic objective in the East.
The objective was no longer seizing territory or the enemy capital, but destroying Lee's army itself. Grant initiated the Overland Campaign in May 1864, resulting in these brutal, bloody battles like the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor.
And Lee displayed his defensive genius, stopping Grant at every turn. But the key difference was the strategic math. Grant used superior manpower and resources to simply absorb the casualties and keep moving southeast.
At Cold Harbor, Grant ordered a disastrous frontal assault that cost 7,000 Union lives in 20 minutes, which Grant later called his greatest regret.
But even after a setback like that, he didn't stop or retreat. That was the brilliance of Grant's attrition strategy. He knew he could replace his losses. Lee could not.
Grant was tenacious, forcing Lee into the trenches he had been ridiculed for building years earlier. And when Grant successfully moved his massive army across the James River, he initiated the Siege of Petersburg.
The Siege of Petersburg lasted from June 1864 until March 1865. It established the industrialized trench warfare that characterized World War I. Lee's army shrank daily due to desertions and desperate supply shortages.
By February 1865, in a gesture that really underscored his indispensable role, Lee was finally appointed General-in-Chief of the armies of the Confederate States.
Facing utter manpower devastation, he reluctantly advocated for the desperate measure of enlisting enslaved people into the Confederate Army in exchange for their freedom.
A move that completely contradicted the foundational premise of the Confederacy.
But the first units were only in training when the war ended. Petersburg fell, Lee retreated west, was surrounded, and surrendered his army to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865.
And it's important to acknowledge his immediate post-surrender action. He famously resisted calls from some officers to scatter and wage a hopeless guerrilla war.
He insisted the war was over and campaigned immediately for intersectional reconciliation, and he made a striking public statement regarding slavery. "I am rejoiced that slavery is abolished. I believe it will be greatly for the interests of the South."
It brings us right back to the contradiction. The man who administered slavery so harshly could also declare himself relieved that the institution was gone.
Perhaps viewing the end of slavery as the end of the moral and political conflict that had plagued the nation. And that sets the stage for his postbellum life and the battle over his evolving legacy.
Right after the war, he transitioned immediately into civilian leadership, accepting the presidency of Washington College.
Which is now Washington and Lee University. He served from 1865 until his death, and he used his enormous post-war fame to transform the small college.
How did he transform it?
He modernized it. He expanded the curriculum beyond just classical studies, adding practical forward-thinking courses in commerce and journalism. He also established the famous honor system, telling the students, "We have but one rule here, and it is that every student be a gentleman."
He was actively trying to rebuild the South's civil and economic leadership. And he showed a commitment to national reconciliation, at least among white citizens, by actively recruiting students from the North.
His reflection on his career at this time is so poignant. He confided to a colleague that the greatest mistake of his life was taking a military education. He clearly viewed his final years as a chance to contribute to the nation's recovery through education rather than conflict.
But his post-war politics and his views on race ensured he remained a champion of white supremacy, even as he promoted national reconciliation.
Exactly. He opposed the Congressional Radical Republican program for Reconstruction, viewing it as too harsh and too empowering for freedmen.
This is laid out very clearly in his 1866 congressional testimony. While he expressed kind feelings towards the freedmen and believed they should be educated, his underlying racial bias was stark.
He stated he did not believe the black man was as capable of acquiring knowledge as the white man is.
And his opposition to black political power was forthright. He forthrightly opposed black suffrage, arguing that, at this time, they black Southerners cannot vote intelligently, and that giving them the vote would only lead to demagogism.
And that concept of demagogism is important context. The term implies a fear that newly enfranchised black citizens would be manipulated by white political agitators, often Northerners, to vote against the established political and social order of the South.
So he was essentially arguing that immediate black political power would lead to chaos and instability, necessitating the continuation of white political control.
And this period of reconciliation also contains a notable silence. The sources point out that he was urged to condemn the Ku Klux Klan, the white supremacy organization that was terrorizing the South, but he chose not to speak out against them publicly.
His focus was entirely on promoting obedience to the law and order among white Southerners. His choice to remain silent on the violence of the KKK. It speaks to his prioritization of stability over defending the rights and physical safety of the freedmen.
And there's a bureaucratic footnote to his life that is truly heartbreaking, given his later veneration as a national figure, his citizenship.
Yes, Lee applied for amnesty and signed an oath of allegiance in 1865, fulfilling the requirement for the restoration of his rights.
However, his application was never processed by the Secretary of State due to what was later described as a clerical error.
So Lee died on October 12, 1870, in Lexington, Virginia, after suffering a stroke without his U.S. citizenship ever being restored.
There are conflicting reports about his final words. Some claim he mumbled, "Tell Hill he must come up, strike the tent," a return to the battlefield command he had known. And in a bizarre twist of fate related to his burial, he was interred without shoes because local flooding prevented a suitable, custom-made coffin from arriving in Lexington in time.
Such a strange, humbling detail for a figure of his stature. His citizenship was finally restored posthumously by President Gerald Ford in 1975, following a joint resolution by Congress.
But by then, his legacy had been solidified and then fractured by the Lost Cause movement. Immediately after the war, he was elevated to the central figure of that interpretation.
Portrayed as the ideal, honorable soldier, a foe without hate, who fought purely for his state and constitutional principle, completely sanitizing the cause of secession.
Admirers praised him endlessly. Military figures like Field Marshal Garnet Wolseley compared his 1862 operations favorably to Napoleon's 1796 campaigns. The Marble Man image served this massive cultural need, allowing Americans, North and South, to reconcile by celebrating the general's honor while conveniently ignoring the reason he fought.
The veneration was widespread and visible. Arlington House was designated a national memorial in 1955, and monuments just proliferated across the South. These dedications, like the equestrian statue on Monument Avenue in Richmond, were designed to enshrine the narrative that Lee was a figure of honor and tragedy, independent of slavery.
But history rarely remains static, does it? In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the historiographical shift began in earnest, challenging that narrative by focusing on the consequences of his actions rather than just his personal integrity.
Historians started questioning his strategic prowess, particularly his high-risk gambles. Some modern statistical studies measuring wins above replacement for generals even suggest Lee's reckless aggression may have had a net negative impact on the Confederacy's overall war effort.
By hemorrhaging irreplaceable manpower at Gettysburg and elsewhere, and the focus shifted back to the complexities we discussed today. His actions as a slaveholder, the Norris case, his post-war refusal to support freedmen's rights.
And this reassessment is what fuels the intense public debate we see today, particularly around his monuments.
It's a dramatic conflict between two views of history. Despite Lee's own stated opposition to public memorials, he became widely commemorated. But the recent wave of monument removal, exemplified by the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally in 2017 and the removal of the massive Richmond statue in 2021, reflects a society grappling with whether to define him by his military genius or by his role as a champion of a slave-holding republic.
This deep dive has certainly revealed a figure defined by enormous paradoxes. We've traced the U.S. Army engineer who chose Virginia over the Union, the man who condemned slavery as an evil but profited from it, ordered the flogging of runaways, and vigorously opposed black equality after the war.
And we've analyzed the highly skilled tactician, the Marsa Robert, whose aggressive strategy, most clearly at Gettysburg, may have been the very thing that doomed the Confederate cause by consuming manpower Grant knew he could replace.
The story of Lee is really the story of America selecting which version of history it wants to memorialize, the honorable, duty-bound soldier or the Confederate leader fighting for human bondage.
What stands out to me is the immense pressure he felt to define himself by this narrow code of state loyalty and gentlemanly honor, even if it meant betraying the national army that had trained him and the constitutional government he initially believed in. His life exemplifies the tragic flaw of the antebellum elite.
A localized, almost feudal concept of loyalty over a national commitment.
Exactly. The Marble Man myth allowed us to forget that his choices had devastating, concrete consequences, military, moral, and political, that continue to shape the American landscape today.
And that leads to our final provocative thought for you, the listener, to carry with you. We established that Lee insisted that secession is nothing but revolution, and he would sacrifice the 4 million enslaved people to save the Union. What does it mean for the nature of American patriotism that the man who viewed the dissolution of the Union as an accumulation of all the evils ultimately became the most revered military champion of that very cause?